a boy begged not to leave school with his uncle. Suspecting something, the teacher decided to follow them to their home. What she saw when she arrived at the house left her completely horrified. Charlotte locked the classroom and let out a light sigh. She whispered to herself, "Another day completed." Feeling both proud and very tired. Being a preschool teacher meant experiencing a daily roller coaster of emotions and challenges. Ever since she was little, her biggest dream had been to teach. As she walked through the school hallways, she reflected on the activities she had conducted that day, wondering if the children had enjoyed the story she told, and thinking she needed to find more interesting books like that one. She headed to her car, following the same path she had taken for 6 years since she started working at Sunshine School. When she arrived home, she found the dinner that Jason, her husband, who was still at work, had prepared. "He always thinks of everything," she thought with a smile, seeing her favorite stew on the stove. As she heated the food, she talked to herself, "Ah, Jason, you really know how to cheer me up after a tiring day." Jason, though not the most famous cook in El Paso, had a great love for cooking. He made sure to prepare all the meals for the couple, always seeking to provide moments of calm for Charlotte. For him, cooking was a way to show his love and care, ensuring that Charlotte found joy and comfort in the dishes he prepared with such dedication. Due to their opposing work schedules, with Charlotte at school during the day and Jason at the restaurant in the evening, they had little time together during the week, but both were saving to fulfill their dream of buying a larger house and having a child. Seated at the table, Charlotte let her thoughts flow while she ate. "I need to think of a new way to teach math, maybe using games. Kids love games," she reflected as she slowly savored her meal. After dinner, Charlotte started to grade the students' activity books. "Let's see how you all did today," she said as she opened the books. She made detailed notes, thinking about each student. "Timothy is improving in writing, but Anna needs more help with math," she noted while marking the books with stars and encouraging comments. After finishing the grading, fatigue hit hard. Charlotte glanced at the clock, noting that it was still a while before Jason would arrive. Normally, she waited for him, but that night she was too tired. She decided not to fight the sleep, quickly organized herself, and went to bed, leaving a note for Jason in the kitchen. The next day, Charlotte arrived at school renewed and ready for another day full of activities and learning. During the morning, while teaching a new song to the children, she was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. It was Dr. Michael Brown, the school principal, with a boy by his side. "Charlotte, may I have a word with you?" he asked. In the principal's office, Dr. Michael Brown introduced the new student. "This is Brian," he said, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. Brian looked shy, dressed in simple clothes and keeping his gaze low. "Brian will be joining your class from today," continued Dr. Michael Brown. Charlotte crouched down to be at eye level with Brian and smiled at him. "Welcome, Brian. I'm so glad you're in our class," she said, trying to convey warmth and welcome. Brian, however, didn't react much, just nodding his head in acknowledgement. The principal then asked Charlotte to take Brian to the classroom and introduce him to the other children. "Of course, Dr. Michael Brown. Come on, Brian," said Charlotte, extending her hand to the boy. He followed her hesitantly, still without saying a word. Entering the classroom, Charlotte noticed the curiosity in the other children's eyes. "Everyone, we have a new friend in our class," she announced, encouraging Brian to step forward. "This is Brian. Let's make him feel welcome." The children responded with a chorus of, "Hello, Brian," while he just waved timidly, still adjusting to the new environment. The class proceeded as usual, and Charlotte made an effort to include Brian in the activities. While walking around the room observing the students working, she noticed Brian's notebook. It was old, with worn edges and few blank pages left. She approached him and asked softly, "Brian, don't you have a new notebook for the start of the year?" Brian looked up at her, his brown eyes reflecting a subtle sadness. "This is all I have, teacher," he replied, lowering his voice. Charlotte felt a twinge of concern. She knew how important proper school materials were for children's learning. Without hesitation, she went to her locker and took out a new notebook, still wrapped. Returning to Brian's table, she placed the notebook in front of him. "Here, Brian, you can use this," she said, smiling to encourage him. Brian looked at the new notebook, his eyes lighting up a bit. "Thank you, teacher," he murmured, almost inaudibly. During recess, Charlotte observed the children playing in the yard. Brian was sitting alone, away from the others. She approached another teacher, Anna, and said, "I'm worried about Brian. He's always alone." Anna looked towards Brian and said, "It's normal, Charlotte. He just arrived. Kids take a while to get used to new classmates." Charlotte, nevertheless, couldn't help but worry. She watched Brian, who was playing with a piece of chalk, drawing on the ground. "Maybe I should try to integrate him more," she thought. When recess ended, Charlotte helped the children organize to return to the classroom. She noticed that Brian was the last to stand up, carefully gathering his school supplies and placing them inside his faded backpack. She approached him and said, "Brian, you draw very well. Would you like to show your drawings to the class someday?" Brian seemed surprised by the offer, but shook his head no and walked towards the door. At the end of the school day, as the children left in the typical end-of-class commotion, Charlotte watched from a distance. Her eyes followed Brian, who walked slowly towards the school gate. From afar, she saw an older man approach him. The man looked older and wore simple clothes, much like Brian. He led the boy to an old car, and they both got in. Charlotte watched the car drive away, thinking that the man might be Brian's father. Back home, Charlotte found Jason, who had the day off. He was in the kitchen, preparing something that smelled deliciously good. Seeing her, Jason smiled and asked, "How was your day, love?" Charlotte sat on the kitchen counter and started to tell him about Brian. "It's all right, but there's a new student in my class, Jason. He seems so lonely, and his things are so old, he didn't even have a place to write down the lesson." Jason, listening attentively, expressed his concern. "It's sad to think that a child doesn't have proper materials to study," he said while stirring something in the pot. "Do you know who his parents are?" Charlotte shook her head. "Not much. Today I saw a man pick him up. He seemed to be his father, or maybe a relative. He was in a very old car." She continued, "He's very quiet, Jason. Today I gave him a new notebook because his was almost out of pages. You should have seen his face." Jason nodded, placing a hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "You always do your best for your students, Charlotte. I'm sure he'll open up more over time." As they talked, Charlotte felt a mix of concern and determination. She knew that, as a teacher, she played an important role in her students' lives, and Brian would be no exception. She decided she would do her best to understand his situation and offer whatever help she could. The next day, Charlotte arrived at school early, ready for another day of work. She watched the children entering, noticing that Brian had not yet arrived. When he finally appeared, Charlotte immediately noticed the state of his clothes and nails, which were dirty. She felt a twinge of concern, questioning the conditions in which the boy lived. During recess, while the children ran to grab their snacks, Charlotte noticed that Brian only took out a squashed piece of bread from his backpack. In contrast, the other children had varied and colorful snacks. She remembered the sandwich Jason had made for her earlier. Without hesitation, she took the sandwich from her bag and approached Brian. "Brian, I brought an extra sandwich today. Would you like to try it?" asked Charlotte, offering the sandwich. Brian looked at the sandwich, then at Charlotte, clearly embarrassed. He shook his head, declining, but Charlotte insisted, "It's really tasty. I'm sure you'll like it." Reluctantly, Brian accepted the sandwich and began to eat, his expression revealing how hungry he was. Seizing the moment, Charlotte tried to talk to him. "Brian, that man who picks you up from school, is he your father?" she asked gently. Brian lowered his head and murmured, "No, he's my uncle. I don't know who my father is." Charlotte felt her heart tighten with the boy's response. It was clear there was much more to Brian's life than she had imagined. She sat next to him, trying to offer some comfort. "You can talk to me whenever you want, Brian. I'm here to help," she said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Brian just nodded, saying nothing more. Charlotte realized that earning his trust would take time. Leaving Brian with his sandwich, Charlotte headed to the principal's office, Dr. Michael Brown. She knocked gently on the door before entering, finding the principal seated behind his desk, surrounded by piles of papers. "Dr. Michael Brown, may I speak with you for a moment?" asked Charlotte, closing the door behind her. Dr. Michael Brown looked up at her over his glasses. Of course, Charlotte. What can I do for you? Charlotte took a deep breath, gathering courage to express her concerns. It's about the new student, Brian. I've noticed a few things. He always arrives in dirty clothes, and today he only had a piece of bread to eat. I'm worried. Dr. Michael Brown sighed and removed his glasses. Charlotte, his uncle, registered him. Seemed like an ordinary man, and he didn't mention any problems. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing wrong. Charlotte insisted, but he doesn't seem well. The clothes, the food, doesn't that seem concerning to you? The principal shook his head, clearly impatient. Charlotte, you're overreacting. These are personal issues. You should focus on your job and stop imagining things. Charlotte felt a mix of frustration and disbelief at Dr. Michael Brown's response. She knew he had a reputation for being somewhat self-centered and not genuinely caring about the children, but she had hoped for more understanding. Dr. Michael Brown, as an educator, I feel it is my duty to look after the well-being of my students, said Charlotte, trying to remain calm. If a student is not well, it affects their learning and development. Dr. Michael Brown raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Charlotte, do your job. If there's a real problem, we'll deal with it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have many papers to sign. Charlotte left the office feeling disappointed and somewhat helpless. She knew that despite the principal's reaction, she could not simply ignore what she saw in Brian. Charlotte was determined to better understand Brian's situation. During recess, while the children played in the yard, an incident caught her attention. One of the students, seemingly provocative, approached Brian and began to taunt him, calling him poor and smelly boy. Brian, clearly hurt, was ready to retaliate, but Charlotte quickly intervened, gently holding his arm. She firmly reprimanded the provoking boy. Go to the office now and wait there. We will talk about your behavior later, she said, looking him in the eyes seriously. The boy, aware that he had gone too far, ran off towards the principal's office. Charlotte then turned to Brian, who was trying to hold back tears. Brian, don't listen to what he said. You are a very special boy, and you don't deserve those words. Charlotte spoke tenderly, trying to console him. Brian looked at the ground, his tears silently falling. Seeing how upset he was, Charlotte had an idea. How about we go for some ice cream? Just the two of us? She asked. Brian, surprised, timidly asked about the class. Don't worry, I'll ask another teacher who is already free to cover my class for the second part. Today is a special day for you, explained Charlotte. After some persuasion, Brian agreed, still a bit suspicious. She took Brian to a nearby ice cream shop. It was a small and cozy place with various flavors on display. Brian looked at the display, clearly impressed by the colors and varieties. Choose any flavor you want, Brian, said Charlotte, encouraging him. He chose chocolate ice cream, still a bit hesitant. Sitting at the table, Charlotte watched Brian eat his ice cream. At first, he was shy, but as he continued, a genuine smile began to form on his face. It was the first time Charlotte had seen the boy smile. It was a small step, but significant for both of them. After the visit to the ice cream shop, Charlotte returned with Brian to school. Upon their arrival, they were immediately approached by the principal, Dr. Michael Brown, who questioned Charlotte about leaving the school with a student during class hours. Charlotte, this is unacceptable. Why did you leave the school with Brian? He asked, with a clearly disapproving tone. Charlotte, somewhat apprehensive, explained the situation. Dr. Michael Brown, after the incident at recess, Brian was very upset. I just wanted to help him feel better. We went for ice cream nearby, she said, hoping the principal would understand her intention. However, Dr. Michael Brown remained inflexible. That's no justification, Charlotte. What if his uncle had come to pick him up and he wasn't here? She argued that she knew the schedules and was sure there would be no problem. I just wanted to help Dr. Michael Brown. I knew there was no risk, Charlotte insisted. The principal, still dissatisfied, warned her. Don't do this again, Charlotte. It could cause problems in the future. By the way, Brian's uncle is on his way to pick him up. I've already called him to inform him of the incident. Hearing that Brian's uncle was coming, Charlotte decided to wait and talk to him. She wanted to better understand the boy's situation and see if there was anything more she could do to help. While waiting, she observed Brian, who now seemed a bit more at ease thanks to their brief escape from school. When Brian's uncle arrived, his expression was calm, but there was a trace of coldness in his gaze. Brian immediately went to his side, keeping his head down, as if trying to hide from the world. The uncle looked directly at Charlotte and asked seriously, "What happened here?" "I received a concerning call from the principal." Charlotte, trying to be as clear and kind as possible, explained, "There was an incident today. Brian was provoked by another student. I intervened before the situation escalated. He was about to retaliate, but I managed to calm him down." Brian's uncle seemed genuinely surprised by this information. "Brian doesn't usually react like that. He's a calm boy," said the uncle, casting a worried glance at the boy. Charlotte, noticing that the uncle was a bit suspicious but responsive to her questions, decided to address another sensitive issue. "I've also noticed that Brian sometimes comes to school with his clothes and nails a bit dirty. I just wanted to know if everything is all right at home," she asked, choosing her words carefully. Brian's uncle responded, slightly uncomfortable but without hostility, "I'll pay more attention to that. Things get a bit hectic at home sometimes." Charlotte then mentioned another concern. "Brian rarely does his homework. I think it might be affecting his learning," she said, hoping the uncle would realize the importance of the issue. The uncle looked at Brian, who still kept his eyes down, and said, "I really didn't know about that. I'll start checking his notebooks. Thank you for letting me know." Feeling that establishing direct communication would be beneficial, Charlotte asked if she could have his phone number. "In case we need to discuss anything about Brian," she explained. The uncle hesitated but eventually agreed. "All right, here's my number. Call if you need to." He wrote the number on a piece of paper and handed it to Charlotte. Charlotte thanked him and watched as the uncle and Brian walked away. She felt that despite the uncle's evasiveness, she had managed to establish a channel of communication, which could be crucial for understanding and helping Brian. She held the paper with the number, thinking about the next steps and the best way to approach the situation. When she got home, Charlotte found Jason in the kitchen preparing dinner. She sat at the table looking thoughtful. Jason, noticing her expression, asked, "Are you all right, Charlotte? You seem worried." She sighed and began to tell him about her conversation with Brian's uncle. "I talked to Brian's uncle today. He's quite reserved, didn't give much detail about their lives. And Brian, he hardly raised his eyes near him. That made me quite worried." Jason listened attentively, only interrupting to ask for details. "But did you get any useful information? Anything that might help to better understand the situation?" Charlotte shook her head. "Not much, but he gave me his phone number. I'll observe Brian over the next few days and see if I can find out anything more." Jason, always supportive of his wife, said, "You're doing the right thing, Charlotte. Keeping an eye on him is important. Maybe with time he'll start to open up more to you." He then paused, thoughtful, before suggesting, "What if we bought some clothes for Brian? It could help him feel a little more comfortable at school." Charlotte looked at Jason, surprised and touched by the suggestion. "Would you do that? It would be wonderful for him. He always comes in the same clothes, and I'm sure he would feel better going to school a bit cleaner," she said with a grateful smile. "Of course I'll pay for it. Don't worry about that," Jason replied with a gentle smile. "You have a big heart, Jason." "Thank you," said Charlotte, clearly moved by her husband's generosity. The next day, Charlotte arrived at school earlier than usual, carrying a bag with the new clothes she had bought for Brian. She stood at the door, anxious, waiting for the boy to arrive. When Brian finally showed up, she discreetly called him aside and handed him the bag. "I brought something for you," she said with a smile. Brian opened the bag and his eyes lit up at the sight of the new clothes, but soon his expression changed to one of concern. "What's wrong, Brian?" Charlotte asked, noticing the sudden change. "It's just that my uncle, he told me not to accept things from other people and also not to talk about our life," Brian replied, looking around as if he feared being overheard. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine upon hearing that. "That's strange, Brian. Why would he say something like that?" she asked, trying to understand the situation. Brian just shrugged. clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Charlotte realized that the conversation she had with the boy's uncle the day before might have triggered this reaction. Even after talking with Brian's uncle, Charlotte noticed that the boy still seemed unkempt. His hair was disheveled, and his nails, although cleaner, still showed signs of neglect. Charlotte's concern grew even more when, during class, she noticed that Brian's homework was done in handwriting that clearly wasn't his. She discreetly called Brian aside after class. "Brian, who did your homework? The handwriting here doesn't seem like yours," she asked, showing him the notebook. Brian lowered his head and murmured something unintelligible. Charlotte felt frustrated and worried. "Brian, you can trust me. If something is happening, I want to help," she said. But the boy remained silent, refusing to speak further on the matter. After the conversation with Brian, Charlotte felt that she needed to take action. She knew it was a risky decision, but she decided that during lunch, when the principal usually left, she would check Brian's documents in his office. She discreetly watched the principal leave the school, and as soon as he was gone, quickly entered his office. Charlotte's heart raced as she searched for Brian's documentation. The folders were organized by year and alphabetically, which made her search easier. Finally, she found Brian's folder and began to leaf through the documents. She was looking for any information about the boy's family, particularly about his parents. In the documents, Charlotte found the names of Brian's mother and father, but what caught her attention most was the name of the person who had enrolled him, his uncle, Ronald Allen. She continued to look, hoping to find their address, but to her surprise, that field was empty. Why would someone leave the address blank, she thought. Feeling her concern grow even more, she decided to look further and didn't notice that time was passing quicker than she could perceive. As Charlotte was putting the documents back in the folder, she heard the door open. It was the principal, Dr. Michael Brown, who had returned earlier from lunch. Surprised, he asked, "Charlotte, what are you doing here?" She quickly turned around, slightly startled, but tried to appear calm. "Oh, Dr. Michael Brown, I was looking for information about the upcoming parent-teacher meeting. Since you weren't here, I thought I'd quickly check." Dr. Michael Brown looked at her with a suspicious expression, but then nodded. "The meeting is next week. I'll send an email with the details," he said, still a bit doubtful. Charlotte thanked him and quickly left the room, her heart still racing. She knew she had narrowly escaped and would need to be more cautious in the future. Charlotte had barely taken a few steps down the hallway when Dr. Michael Brown called her back. "Charlotte, you have a call," he said, handing her the phone. She took the handset, curious. "Hello?" she asked. On the other end, an anxious voice replied, "Teacher Charlotte, it's me, Ronald, Brian's uncle. I have a problem here. My car broke down, and I'm stuck in the neighboring town. I can't pick up Brian today, could you?" Before Ronald could finish, Charlotte interrupted. "Of course I can take Brian home, but are you all right?" Ronald took a deep breath on the other side of the line. "Yes, I'm fine. Just stuck here. Oh, and please don't mention this to the principal or anyone at the school. It's better that way." Charlotte felt a chill, but agreed. "All right, Ronald, I'll take care of it." When she hung up, Dr. Michael Brown was there, waiting. "Was it about Brian?" he asked. Charlotte, still processing the odd request, responded quickly. "Yes, it was his uncle. He was asking about Brian's grades." At the end of the class, Charlotte approached Brian, who seemed anxious for some news. "Brian, your uncle had a problem and can't pick you up today. I'll take you to my house, and you can sleep there. Tomorrow, I'll take you to school, and your uncle will pick you up at the end of the day," she explained, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. Brian, with a look of concern, responded quickly, "No, teacher. My uncle said I can't go out with other people." Charlotte, without a second thought, spoke warmly. "I understand, Brian, but it's just for one night, and your uncle knows about it. It'll be all right, I promise." After a few moments of hesitation, Brian nodded, still clearly nervous about the situation. Charlotte took out her cell phone and sent a message to Jason. "Jason, Brian will be staying with us tonight. Can you prepare something nice for dinner? I think he'll like it." When they arrived home, Brian seemed very shy and unsure of how to behave. Jason greeted them at the door with a warm smile. "Hello, Brian. Welcome. "We're having a special dinner tonight, champ," he said, trying to cheer up the boy. Brian looked at Jason and then at Charlotte, clearly still a bit uncomfortable, but the welcoming environment seemed to be helping. "Do you like roast chicken, Brian?" Jason asked as he led him to the kitchen. Brian nodded timidly, and Jason continued, "Great, I'll make my special roast chicken for you." While Jason prepared dinner, Charlotte showed Brian where he would be sleeping and gave him some clean clothes she had bought on the way home. "You can wear these clothes, Brian. I hope they're comfortable," she said. Brian, still shy, thanked her quietly. After dinner, Charlotte led Brian to the guest room. When he went to change his clothes, she noticed through the slightly open door that he was surprisingly thin. Moreover, his shoes, old and worn out, seemed to have seen better days. "Brian, feel at home, okay? There's no reason to be afraid here," said Charlotte, trying to convey security. Brian, now dressed in clean and comfortable clothes, looked at Charlotte. "My uncle, he won't like seeing me here. He'll be upset with me," the boy said, his voice trembling with fear. Charlotte crouched down to Brian's level. "You're safe here, Brian. Nothing bad will happen, I promise," she tried to assure him, but the boy remained uneasy. Charlotte gently tried to learn more about the situation at home. "Brian, can you tell me what happens at home? If something is bothering you, I can try to help," she asked. However, Brian shook his head. "I can't, teacher. I promised my uncle I wouldn't talk about it. Can I go to sleep now?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. Charlotte felt a tightness in her chest, hearing this. "Of course, Brian, I'll leave the door open. If you need anything, just call," she said, forcing a smile. As she left the room, she gently closed the door, leaving a crack open. Heading to the living room where Jason was, Charlotte shared her observations and concerns. "Jason, this doesn't seem right. There's something very serious going on with Brian at his uncle's house. I need to do something. I can't just leave things as they are," she said, the determination in her voice clear. Jason looked at her, his eyes full of support. "I know you'll find a way to help, Charlotte. We're in this together," he replied. Charlotte woke up before sunrise, driven by a mix of determination and concern. She went to the kitchen and began preparing a hearty breakfast, thinking of Brian. As she placed the dishes on the table, she called gently, "Brian, breakfast is ready." Jason joined them in the kitchen, trying to create a relaxed atmosphere. As they ate, Jason tried to engage Brian in conversation. "So Brian, tell me more about your family," Jason said, trying to sound casual. Brian, however, seemed uncomfortable with the question and replied hesitantly, "I can't talk about that." It was then that Brian, looking at the bread on the table, asked timidly, "Can I take one of these breads home? I'm always hungry, and sometimes there isn't much food." Hearing this, Charlotte felt a painful squeeze in her heart. "Of course you can, Brian. I'll prepare a nice snack for you to take," she said, forcing a smile to hide her concern. While Charlotte was preparing the snack, Brian watched with attentive eyes. He then murmured, almost inaudibly, "It must be really nice to have a family that takes care of you like this." Those words deeply touched Charlotte and Jason. They exchanged looks, their eyes filled with emotion. Jason, trying to keep his voice steady, replied, "You know, Brian, families are made in different ways sometimes. And the most important thing is that there are always people who care about you." Charlotte nodded, adding, "And you will always have people who care about you, Brian, always." As soon as they finished eating, Charlotte took Brian to school, feeling a mix of anxiety and concern. During classes, she struggled to focus on the activities, but her mind was always on the end of the day when she would have the opportunity to speak with Ronald, Brian's uncle. She needed to better understand the boy's situation and was determined to get some answers. As the afternoon progressed, Charlotte's anxiety grew. She was alert to every car that approached the school, waiting to see Ronald. Outside, Brian played alone, his expression darker than usual. Noticing this, Charlotte approached the boy. "Brian, are you okay? You seem worried," she asked gently. Before Brian could answer, a car stopped in front of the school. It was Ronald. He got out of the car and asked Brian how his day was. Then he turned to Charlotte and said, with a speed that almost hid his intention, "Thanks for taking care of him, but I'm going to have to move Brian to another school." Upon hearing this, Brian reacted instantly. His eyes filled with tears, and in a burst, he ran to Charlotte, clinging to her. "Please, teacher, don't let him take me. I don't want to go," the boy pleaded, sobbing. Charlotte felt her heart constrict at the sight of Brian's desperation. Ronald seemed surprised by Brian's reaction. He took a step toward the boy, but Charlotte intervened. "Ronald, what's going on? Why do you want to move Brian from school so suddenly?" she asked, her voice firm despite the emotional turmoil. Brian continued, clinging to Charlotte, crying inconsolably. Ronald hesitated, seeming uncomfortable with the situation. "With all due respect, teacher, but this is none of your business. I know what's best, not you. Come on, Brian, now," he said, already irritated. As Ronald put Brian in the car, Charlotte was momentarily paralyzed, watching the boy plead. "Please don't take me. I want to stay here." Brian screamed with tears streaming down his face. Ronald, without saying a word, just pulled him more firmly, ignoring the boy's protests. Charlotte, snapping out of her shock, started running toward the car. "Wait, Brian," she shouted, but it was too late. Ronald had already put the boy in the car and was getting into the vehicle. Charlotte stopped, panting, next to the car, banging on the window. "Ronald, what are you doing? This isn't right." Ronald, without looking at Charlotte, just accelerated the car and drove off. Charlotte stood there, watching the car drive away, feeling a mix of anger and despair. "I have to follow them. I need to know where he's taking Brian," she thought, running to her own car. As she drove, Charlotte tried to stay calm, but her heart raced. "What's going on? What is this man hiding?" she wondered, keeping a safe distance from Ronald's car. She knew she had to be discreet to avoid being noticed. She thought about calling the police, but hesitated. "What if I mess things up and make it worse for Brian? I need to be discreet. I don't know what this man is capable of," Charlotte considered, deciding to continue following Ronald on her own for now. "First, I need to find out where they're going." Charlotte continued to drive, following Ronald's car through the streets. Her mind was focused, but her heart was heavy with worry. "I'll find out the truth, Brian. I'll keep you safe," she silently promised, determined to do whatever it was necessary to protect her student. Charlotte pressed the accelerator, trying to keep Ronald's car in her line of sight. He drove recklessly, increasing speed and making sharp turns. Charlotte knew she had to maintain distance, but also could not lose sight of him. What is he trying to hide? Why is he driving so fast? She wondered, her heart pounding. As Charlotte followed increasingly remote roads away from the city, the strangeness of the situation became ever more apparent. Ronald seemed to be heading toward a more isolated area, which only heightened the sense of urgency and danger. In a moment of relative calm, when she stopped at a red light, Charlotte quickly grabbed her phone and called Jason. "Jason, I'm following Brian's uncle. He's driving really fast and we're moving away from the city," she said, her voice shaking with the tension of the moment. On the other end of the line, Jason responded, his voice laden with worry. "Charlotte, this is very dangerous. You need to come back. We don't know what this man is capable of." However, Charlotte was resolute. "I can't turn back now, Jason. I need to save this boy. I'm going to see this through," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "I'm sending you my location," she added. Jason, on the other end, felt a mix of fear and admiration for Charlotte's courage. "I'm coming after you, but I'm far away. It'll take me a while to get there," he replied, already preparing to leave. As the light turned green, Charlotte resumed the pursuit. She knew she was putting herself in danger, but her concern for Brian and her desire to protect him outweighed any hesitation. She drove cautiously but determinedly, following Ronald's every move. With each mile traveled, the tension increased, but Charlotte was determined not to give up. Ronald had now turned onto a dirt road that wound through dense woods. She kept a safe distance to avoid making noise that might draw attention. The road led to a secluded area, and Charlotte felt a knot in her stomach, thinking about what she might find there. Ronald's car eventually stopped beside a rudimentary shack surrounded by tall weeds and scattered trash. Charlotte parked her car a little distance away and moved quietly toward the shack. She needed to see what was happening inside, but knew she had to be extremely careful. As she approached, Charlotte found a small window through which she could peer inside. What she saw inside the ramshackle building shocked her. The place was dirty and neglected, with an old stained mattress on the floor. Brian was sitting on the mattress, visibly shaken. Ronald was speaking to the boy, his voice sounding firm and somewhat impatient. "Brian, stop crying. This had to be done. You'll understand later," he said. Brian, between sobs, pleaded, "Please, uncle, don't take me away from my school. I like it there. I like my teacher." Charlotte, hidden, watched the scene, feeling a mix of anger and compassion. She knew she needed evidence to report the situation. Quietly, she took out her phone and began recording what she was seeing through the window. The images were shocking but necessary. As she filmed, Charlotte listened to Brian continue to plead. "I promise I'll be good. Just don't take me away from there," the boy said, his voice choked with tears. Ronald seemed unmoved, responding curtly, "It's already decided, Brian. Now enough talk." Just as she was preparing to leave, her foot accidentally brushed against a plastic bottle hidden in the tall grass. The sound of the crumpled plastic broke the silence of the place, making a sharp noise that echoed in the quiet of the evening. She froze, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Almost immediately, the shack door burst open and Ronald appeared, his surprised and frightened gaze meeting Charlotte. "What are you doing here?" he demanded to know, his voice a mix of shock and fear. He approached her, clearly disturbed by having been discovered. Meanwhile, Brian, hearing the noise and his uncle's voice, ran out of the shack toward Charlotte. "Teacher, you came to get me," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with hope and fear. Charlotte, still trying to process the situation, turned to Ronald. "Please calm down. I'm only here because I care about Brian. I'm not going to do anything. I just want to understand what's happening," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Ronald paused for a moment, looking between Charlotte and Brian. "I'm not a bad person." "You're misunderstanding everything," he spoke rapidly, his voice low but firm. Charlotte, still confused by the situation, took a deep breath, seeking clarity. "Then please explain. What's going on here?" There was palpable tension in the air as Ronald seemed to struggle internally with what to say. "It's complicated," he began. "It's not what you think." Charlotte observed Ronald, sensing the complexity of the situation. She knew she needed to listen to what he had to say to fully understand what was happening with Brian. As Ronald hesitated to start his explanation, Charlotte looked at Brian, who clung to her, seeking some comfort. She put an arm around him, silently assuring him that everything would be all right. Ronald, with a gesture of his hand, invited Charlotte to enter the shack. "Come in, I'll tell you everything," he said, with a voice conveying a mix of resignation and urgency. Charlotte, despite her distrust, entered the space he called home. The interior was stuffy, with an unpleasant odor predominating, and a clear mess caused mainly by accumulated trash, especially plastic bottles. Inside, Ronald asked Brian to go to the room. "Brian, go play inside, please," he said. The boy obeyed, disappearing into the only room that looked somewhat cared for. It was a small space with a reasonably conditioned mattress, and some toys scattered on the floor, a notable contrast to the rest of the house. Alone, Ronald began to tell his story to Charlotte, who listened attentively. "It's a long story," he began, seeming to weigh each word. "Brian's mother, my sister, passed away last year. She suffered from a severe illness and was raising Brian alone. His father, who is her ex-boyfriend, is a bad, dangerous man." Ronald took a deep breath before continuing his story, seeming to relive each painful moment. "My sister's relationship with Brian's father was always troubled, full of issues. It got progressively worse, and my sister decided to separate. That's when she discovered she was pregnant with Brian," he explained, looking at the floor. He continued, "After Brian was born, my former brother-in-law started stalking her. My sister did everything to protect the boy, to keep him from knowing the truth about his father. She never told Brian who his father was, to spare him the pain. The thing is, she was very poor, just like me. Only with me, it's a bit worse. I live off collecting trash, hence all these bottles. When she passed away, there was no one but me to take care of Brian. I'm uneducated, but I knew I had to protect my nephew," said Ronald, his voice choked with emotion. "Then when Brian's father learned of my sister's death, he decided he wanted to take the boy for himself. He's an evil man, and only God knows what he would do with my nephew. I couldn't let that happen, so I decided to run away with Brian." Ronald explained, now looking directly at Charlotte, his eyes reflecting a mix of fear and determination. "We used the old car my sister had bought with great difficulty. We found this abandoned shack. It was the most remote and isolated place I could find for us to hide. Everything I did was to protect Brian," he said, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "But why did you decide to take Brian out of school?" asked Charlotte, her voice reflecting the confusion she felt. Ronald sighed before answering. "Living hidden as we are, I'm constantly afraid of being discovered. I don't have official custody of Brian, and I realized he was forming a strong bond with you at school. That could be dangerous. If someone decided to look for his biological father, they could find us," he explained, the fear evident in his eyes. "I sent him to school despite the risk because I know how important it is for him to study, to have an education. But now, with the risk increasing, I don't know what to do," Ronald continued, his voice trembling slightly. Charlotte, moved by concern, asked about Brian's food. "And how is Brian's food? Does he have enough to eat?" Ronald lowered his head before answering. "Every day while Brian is at school, I collect and sell recyclable materials. The money I earn barely covers the basics. I buy food for Brian, but often I go without eating so he can have enough. I bought a semi-new mattress for him with the little I managed to save. I sleep on the old mattress," he said, pointing to the corner of the shack where a worn-out mattress lay on the floor. Charlotte realized the extent of Ronald's sacrifices and felt a wave of emotion. "You've been doing all this alone," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Ronald looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "I would do anything to keep Brian safe and happy. He's all I have." Charlotte knew, at that moment, that she needed to do something to help. Their story had touched her heart in a way she couldn't ignore. Ronald looked at Charlotte and continued, "Brian doesn't understand this whole situation. I asked him not to talk to anyone about our life, to avoid being discovered. But he doesn't like living like this. He always cries asking to go to a better place. He wants to play, be a normal kid. I try to do what I can, but I feel powerless for not being able to give him more." Ronald confessed, his voice choked with emotion. Charlotte felt a wave of empathy and determination. "I'm going to help you," she said firmly. She took out her phone and quickly called Jason, telling him the whole situation in a few words. "I'm sending you the location now," she said quickly. On the other end of the line, Jason replied, "Understood, my God. What a situation. I'm coming. I'll call a lawyer friend and see what we can do." When Jason arrived at the shack, he too was shocked by the situation. "This is unbelievable," he said, looking around. "You can't stay here. Come to our house while we figure this out." He explained that he had a lawyer friend who could help sort out Brian's situation. Ronald hesitated, clearly torn between gratitude for the offer and fear of exposing himself and Brian even more. I don't know. This could bring problems for you too," he said, concerned. Jason, however, insisted, "We can't leave you here in these conditions. Plus, with a lawyer, we can find a legal solution to all this." After a moment of silence, Ronald finally nodded. "Okay," he said, a sigh of relief escaping his lips. "Thank you. I don't know how to thank you." At Charlotte and Jason's house, Ronald, Brian, and they settled in as best they could. Charlotte provided clean clothes for Brian, who seemed delighted and relieved by the warm atmosphere. They sat down to eat, and Brian and Ronald, after a long time, could enjoy a nutritious and tasty meal. Jason had contacted his lawyer friend, who quickly got to work on the case. In the following days, the lawyer conducted a thorough investigation, discovering that Brian's father was a fugitive from justice, having committed several crimes, including thefts. Based on the evidence collected and Ronald's testimony about his sister and her suffering with her ex-husband, the lawyer presented a strong case to the judge. After reviewing all the evidence, the judge decided that Ronald, as the only close relative and showing genuine concern for Brian's well-being, should be granted custody of the boy. When Ronald received the news he was at Charlotte and Jason's house, he couldn't contain the emotion and gratitude he felt. I don't know how to thank you," he said, tears running down his face. "You saved my nephew's life and mine." As they celebrated the good news, the phone rang. It was the lawyer, with another update. Brian's father had been arrested that morning during a police operation. Jason shared the news aloud. Ronald could barely believe that nightmare was over. With all the bureaucracy sorted out, Charlotte and Jason had an additional surprise for Ronald. They handed him an envelope containing a significant amount of money. "We were saving for our new house, but we think you need it more now. So we put half of the savings in here," Jason explained, handing over the envelope. "This can help you start over. Find a place to live, buy clothes and food, money we can recover." Ronald looked at the envelope, incredulous. I don't know what to say. This is very generous," he stammered, moved and surprised by their kindness. Charlotte smiled and added, "And there's more, Ronald. Jason has a waiter position at the restaurant where he works. They pay well, and he's willing to teach you everything you need to know." Ronald, still in shock, nodded. "I never imagined receiving so much help. How can I thank you?" Jason replied with a warm smile. "Just accept, Ronald. You deserve a chance to start over, and we're happy to help." Brian, watching everything, seemed overflowing with joy. He ran to Charlotte and Jason, hugging them. "I won't have to leave school, and we'll have a place to live, and I can play with my friends," he said, his voice full of excitement. He turned to Ronald, saying, "Uncle, we'll be okay now, right?" Ronald hugged Brian, tears of relief and happiness streaming down his face. "Yes, we'll be okay, Brian," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. Brian, looking at Charlotte and Jason, said, "You know, I learned in school what a family is, and family is where there's love and care. Thank you for being my family, too." His simple yet profound words touched everyone in the room. Charlotte and Jason moved, hugged Ronald and Brian, knowing they had made a difference in their lives. Together, they formed a new kind of family, bound by love, compassion, and gratitude. If this story has captivated you, I encourage you to show your appreciation with a like and subscribe to our channel to join our community. Your support motivates us to continue delivering exciting stories nearly every day. Don't miss the next extraordinary narration that we are about to release on your screen. We greatly appreciate your support. See you soon.